In this lesson, we'll be exploring the most important tool for digital painting, the brush tool. Digital painting is very much like traditional painting in that we'll be doing pretty much everything by hand, especially at the beginning. Having a selection of brushes suitable for the type of work you're trying to create is crucial to an efficient workflow, and oftentimes that means customizing the brushes you have to better suit your needs. I've included a Digital Painting Essentials brush set as a free download for this course. It has all the basics you'll need to get you started, and we'll also take a look at creating our own custom brushes. You can download the brush set at Proko.com and install it by opening up your brushes menu by right-clicking the canvas with the brush tool selected, click on the gear icon in the top right, and then click Import Brushes. Let's take a look at some of the essential brush types that I find useful for digital painting. The first brush we'll look at is the hard round. This is the stock standard Photoshop brush that you see everybody using. I've modified mine slightly to make it more useful for painting, but we'll look at specific brush settings later. This brush is great for drawing, blocking in color, and painting hard-edged forms. Next is the soft round, or airbrush. This brush is often criticized for looking too plastic or digital, but it's a fantastic tool for rendering, blending, and creating soft forms and edges. You can save a lot of blending time by painting with the soft brush first, then remove the plastic feeling later by painting more textures on top of it. The dual-edged brush is my personal favorite. It has a hard edge on one side and a soft edge on the other, a lot like holding a sharpened charcoal pencil on its side. You can get a wide variety of edges with this brush, which makes it perfect for establishing core shadows, rendering form, and carving out both hard and soft edges. Textured brushes are a whole category of their own, and you'll probably want a few different kinds. They're great for a whole bunch of different things, like adding texture to smooth surfaces, painting organic things like trees and rocks, or adding wear and tear to clothing and armor. Bristle brushes are very versatile and act a lot like a traditional paintbrush. You can use these brushes to render if you want a more traditional look, and they're also really useful for painting things like hair and fur. Now that we have a set of tools that covers all of our bases when painting, let's take a look at what makes them work so we can customize them to our specific needs, and even create our own custom brushes from scratch. Photoshop's brush engine is quite powerful, and there's a lot of options available to us. It may seem overwhelming at first, but don't worry, we're going to go over each category in depth, and there's a lot of repetition between the categories, so once you learn the basics, it's actually pretty easy to use. And don't worry if you're not using Photoshop. Most other painting softwares use a pretty similar type of brush engine, so a lot of the settings that we cover here will be available in whatever program you use. The most essential settings are available at the top of your Photoshop window, so you can edit them on the fly while you're painting. The first setting is size, which simply controls how large or small your brush is. You'll be changing this constantly, so it's good to use shortcuts. By default, changing your brush size is bound to the bracket keys, but I've changed mine to semicolon and apostrophe because there's an unchangeable Photoshop shortcut where Alt plus bracket key changes your selected layer. Now, I use Alt to switch to the eyedropper while I'm painting, so if I also try to change the brush size with a bracket key, it often unintentionally switches which layer I'm working on, which causes me a lot of headache about half an hour later. Whichever hotkeys you choose to use, I'd recommend binding them to your tablet buttons or scroll wheel so you can change them quickly while painting. Additionally, you can hold Alt and right-click, then drag on the canvas to change your brush size with a visual cue. Brush mode allows you to assign a blending mode to your brush, which changes the way it interacts with other pixels on your canvas. We'll explore what all these different modes do later, so for now just know that they're here and this is where you can assign them to your brush. Opacity allows you to control how opaque or transparent your brush stroke is. Turning down the opacity makes your brush stroke translucent and shows the other pixels behind your brush stroke. I prefer to leave this at 100% and control my opacity through pen pressure, which I'll show how to do shortly. You can click the opacity toggle to make any brush's opacity respond to pen pressure, regardless of its individual brush settings. Airbrush mode affects how your brush behaves when you stop moving your pen. The entire brush engine is built on stamps, where your brush is a single image, and as you move your pen, it lays down repeating stamps to create the brush stroke. With Airbrush enabled, your brush will continue laying down stamps even when you stop moving the pen. The speed at which these stamps are laid down is controlled by flow. A higher flow setting will lay down new stamps more quickly when the pen is still. With Airbrush disabled, your brush will stop laying down stamps entirely when you stop moving your pen, and will only continue the stroke when you move the pen again. Smoothing is a method of averaging out your pen information, which can eliminate handshake and input lag, resulting in smoother brush strokes. The higher the setting, the more smoothing is applied. There are two different smoothing modes, with the default being stroke catch-up. This causes the brush stroke to lag slightly behind where your pen is on the tablet. Turning on catch-up on stroke end will cause the brush stroke to finish traveling to where your pen was when you lift it off the tablet surface. The other mode is pulled string, where a circle appears around your brush, and the brush stroke will only follow your pen when it exits the circle. The size of the circle is dictated by the smoothing amount. For painting, I prefer to use stroke catch-up at 10% for some subtle smoothing, but higher settings and pulled string mode can be very useful for doing clean line art. Play with these settings and find what works best for you. A lot of artists like to use a plugin called Lazy Nezumi, which has very similar settings to this, but is a little bit more detailed and has some additional features as well. Angle, quite simply, changes the angle of your brush. It'll have no effect on round brushes, but it can be useful for adjusting texture brushes and calligraphy brushes. The pressure toggle, like the opacity toggle, will cause your brush size to respond to pen pressure, regardless of that brush's settings. Lastly, the symmetry mode allows you to draw and paint with a variety of symmetry options. Click on the icon, choose the symmetry mode you need, place the center where you want it on your canvas, and have fun. You can turn off the symmetry from the same icon and also re-enable your last used symmetry setting if you need to get it back. Next, we'll dive into the brush engine itself. This is where all brushes come to life, and with some practice, you'll be able to create any kind of brush that you can think of. Begin by opening your brush settings with F5. This will show you all the settings available for editing your brush. All edits are non-destructive, so you can change an existing brush however you need, and if you want to save those settings for later, just create a new brush with the new settings. There's a lot to cover here, so let's explore these categories one at a time. The first category is brush tip shape. This controls a lot of the most standard brush settings, including size and angle, which are mirrored in the tool settings from before. There's also a couple of extra settings in here. First is roundness. Remember how we were talking about brushes being made up of repeating stamps? Roundness essentially squashes the stamp along one axis, allowing you to make any brush thinner. Note that it only squashes in one direction, but you can use the flip X and flip Y boxes to change the angle of the stamp and squash. Hardness is only available on standard round brushes, and allows you to smoothly transition between a hard round brush and a soft round brush. This can be very handy while painting for edge control and blending. Also, you can access this slider by right-clicking on your canvas with the brush tool selected, which allows you to change your brush's hardness on the fly. Spacing is a crucial setting to dial in depending on the type of brush you're trying to make. It controls the distance that your pen has to travel before the brush creates another stamp. The lower the spacing, the more densely packed your brush's stamps will be. This is ideal for smooth and painterly brushes, while higher spacing can be useful for texture and scatter brushes. Note that the lower your spacing is, the more processing power is required from your computer to make the brush stroke. so a large brush with a low spacing may get kinda laggy if you don't have a fast computer. The next category is shape dynamics, but before we get into that, let's talk about dynamics in general. Photoshop's brushes use a lot of the same settings across the categories, so learning the logic makes everything a lot more simple. I'll demonstrate these common settings using size dynamics, but remember that these settings appear in a lot of different categories. The first common setting is jitter. This is essentially a randomization option, so on any setting with jitter, you can have Photoshop randomly change that setting as you make your brush stroke. The higher the jitter, the more randomized that setting will be. The second common setting is control. This allows you to control a parameter with a variety of tablet pen inputs, including pen pressure, direction, and tilt. Assigning the right control settings to your brushes makes them much more responsive to your hand, and makes the whole process of painting digitally a lot more fluid and organic. So be sure to experiment with these and try different inputs to find which one feels good to you. The third common setting is minimum, which essentially sets a floor that parameter can't go below. So, for instance, you could set your brush size to be controlled by pen pressure, but set the minimum to 75%. So no matter how lightly you press with your pen, the brush will never dip below 75% of its original size. Let's move on to shape dynamics. As you might guess, this category allows you to manipulate the shape of your brush. The first parameter is size. You'll see all the common settings we just discussed here. This parameter allows you to randomize the size of your brush with jitter, control the size of your brush with pen inputs, and set a minimum brush size. Tilt scale is only available when control is set to pen tilt, and it will control how much your brush size changes between no pen tilt and fully tilted. Next is angle. This allows you to randomize the angle of your brush with jitter and control it with pen inputs. Similarly, roundness allows you to randomize, control, and set a minimum for your brush's roundness. These are all settings we've discussed before. Shape dynamics just allows us to control them in more interesting ways. At the bottom are three checkboxes. Flip X jitter and Flip Y jitter will randomly flip your brush stamp along the X or Y axis for even more randomization. Brush projection is an all-in-one checkbox that causes your brush to respond dynamically to brush tilt, rotation, and direction. I personally don't use brush projection that much, but it can be useful when you're trying to create more organic, traditional feeling brushes, so try it out and see what you think. The next category is scattering. This causes Photoshop to scatter your brush stamps away from the pen at random. A lot like putting paint on a toothbrush and flicking it at the canvas. The scatter slider controls the intensity of the scatter, that is, how far away the brush stamps will be thrown from where you draw on the canvas. You can check both axes to have it scatter in both X and Y directions for more randomness. Note that scattering is heavily dependent on your brush's spacing. The higher your spacing, the less dense your scattering will be, so for many effects, having a higher brush spacing is ideal. You can also set a control for your scattering if you want it to scatter more or less based on pen input. Count is essentially a multiplier for your brush's spacing. Consider your brush spacing the minimum amount of stamps that your brush can scatter, and if you want to increase that without changing the spacing, you can increase the count. So for example, a brush that scatters 5 stamps at a count of 1 will scatter 10 stamps at a count of 2, and so on. Count jitter, like all jitter settings, randomizes the count setting as you continue your brush stroke. This can be useful for things like snowflakes and magic particles, where you want them to feel extra random and be more dense in certain areas, but more spacious in other areas. You can also set a control for count jitter. Scattering is a very useful tool and will let you create a huge variety of effects with your brushes, from lightly randomized texture brushes to natural feeling snowflakes to schools of fish and bubbles. This option can save you a lot of time if you use it effectively. The texture category allows us to apply image textures to our brushes. This can be useful for painting organic-looking forms and breaking away from the digital airbrush style. In a future lesson, we'll be learning how to create our own custom textures, but for now you can use the standard Photoshop textures, or you can download them for free from places like textures.com. It's important to use seamless textures, otherwise you'll see the repetition of the image in your brushstroke. The first setting in the texture category is a drop-down box which will let you select the texture you want to use. You can check Invert to reverse the values of the texture, turning white to black and black to white. This is useful because the value of the texture affects the opacity of your brushstroke depending on which mode you choose, so sometimes you'll need to invert the texture to get the effect you want. Scale allows you to change the size of the texture relative to the brush size. Dial this in to get the right level of texture that you're trying to achieve. Brightness allows you to lighten or darken the texture, which is useful for the same reason as the invert checkbox. The effect of the texture on your brush's opacity is entirely dependent on the texture's values, so controlling the brightness here can make the texture more or less intense. Contrast increases the contrast of the texture's values, pushing the lights and darks further away from each other and eliminating midtones. If you want a more extreme texture with obvious patches of transparency, you can increase the contrast. If you want a more subtle texture to just add some light grit to your brush, a lower contrast is probably ideal. Texture Each Tip allows you to control the texture in relation to your brush stamps. With this unchecked, the texture will be applied to your brush stroke from start to finish. Turning this on will cause the texture to be reapplied to each individual brush stamp. The usefulness of this setting depends entirely on the type of brush you're trying to create, so try it both ways and see which one you prefer. Mode allows you to control how the texture's values are applied to the brush's opacity. There's a lot of different modes to choose from, and we'll learn more about them later. For now, I recommend using Multiply, which will cause light values in the texture to be removed from the brush. And of course, you can adjust this however you need using Invert, Brightness, and Contrast. The next parameter is Depth, which controls how much of the texture versus the original brush is used in the brush stroke. At a value of 100%, the brush stroke is fully textured. At a value of 0, no texture is applied at all. The remaining depth parameters are only available if Texture Each Tip is turned on, and minimum depth is only available if a control mode is selected. It's important to note that texture settings interact strongly with each other, and with your other brush settings too, so there's no right way to set up a texture. Every setting could behave completely differently depending on how the rest of your brush is set up. So the best thing to do is just experiment with it until you get the effect you want. Dual brush is a bit of a wild card, but it can be really useful for creating some dynamic and unpredictable brushes. Essentially what it does is fuse two different brushes together, creating a new hybrid brush that contains aspects of both. It's hard to predict exactly what you'll get when you combine two brushes, so experiment around with it and save any results that are interesting. At the top of the dual brush category is a mode option. This functions just like the texture category's mode option. Dual brush's mode is very dependent on all of your other brush settings. There's no right or wrong answer for which mode you should use, so experiment around with them and see which one gives you the effect you want. Under the mode dropdown is a window with all of your other Photoshop brushes. Clicking on any of these brushes will select it as your dual brush and combine it with the brush you're currently editing. Size controls the size of the dual brush relative to the main brush's size. Again, this will increase when you increase your brush size, so it's merely a percentage of the brush it's being combined with. Spacing, scatter, and count work just like the ones in our primary brush settings, but this time they're affecting the dual brush, so getting these settings right is just a matter of experimentation. This one's my favorite. Color dynamics is basically a collection of jitter options, and each one affects a different property of your brush's color. Apply per tip is the most important setting, as this will decide whether the randomized color will affect your brush stroke as a whole, or whether it will randomize each brush stamp as they are laid down. Turning this on is useful for very randomized color, like confetti, and turning it off can be useful for extreme things like an aurora, or even more subtle things like adding a bit of color variation to a leather texture. Foreground-background jitter will randomize the brush's color between your selected foreground and background colors, which you can set using the two color boxes in your toolbar. You can switch between foreground and background color using X, which is another useful hotkey to bind to your tablet buttons. And this is my favorite part. You can set a control mode for this parameter, allowing you to seamlessly fade between your two selected colors based on pen input. I used this for a set of oil painting brushes I made, where the harder I press my pen, the more it uses my foreground color, resulting in really natural looking brush strokes. All the jitter options function just like other jitters, with hue randomizing the color of the brush, saturation randomizing the saturation or chroma of the brush, and brightness randomizing the value of the brush. Purity is essentially a macro saturation control, so if you want your colors to be more muted, turn it down. If you want them to be more saturated, turn it up. Transfer is one of the most important categories for digital painting, as a huge amount of our work revolves around controlling our brush's opacity. Transfer lets us control our brush opacity with pen pressure, which allows us to control the intensity of our brush stroke without manually changing our settings. Opacity, jitter, control, and minimum function just like our other dynamics, but in this case they affect the opacity of our brush stroke. That is, how opaque or transparent it is. The flow parameters do exactly the same thing, but in this case they're tied to flow. Remember that this only has an effect if your brush has airbrush mode turned on in the tool settings. Wetness and mix are settings that can only be used with the mixer brush, which we'll cover in a future lesson. Brush pose is a selection of macro controls that will override your pen inputs. For example, if your brush's size is controlled by pen pressure, you can check Override Pressure and the brush will now ignore your pen input and instead apply whatever pressure percent you select on the slider. Personally, I haven't found a use for these options, but they're there if you need them. Underneath the brush categories are a handful of checkboxes that slightly alter the brush. They have some niche use cases, but generally you can achieve the same effect in a more interesting way just using your brush settings. Noise adds a small amount of pixelated grain to your brush. This can be useful for certain styles, but I prefer to leave my brush strokes in their natural state and add noise later on a separate layer if I want it. Wet edges makes your brush look slightly watercolory, where the interior of the brush stroke will be slightly transparent and the edge of the brush stroke will be more opaque. This feature resets when you lift your pen off the tablet and begin a new brush stroke. Again, this is somewhat interesting and has some uses, but if you're trying to achieve an authentic watercolor effect, I would create or purchase brushes specifically designed for that, as there are better ways to achieve this look. Build-up is the same as the airbrush toggle in our tool settings from before. Turning it on or off here will turn it on and off in the tool settings. Smoothing is also the same as the smoothing option in our tool settings. Turning it on or off here will do the same there. Protect Texture is a useful feature for transferring the texture settings from one brush to another without recreating it from scratch. If you choose a texture brush you like, turn on Protect Texture and then switch to another brush, that texture will be automatically applied to the brush you switched to. This can be useful if you're trying to create a painting with a canvas texture and want the texture to remain consistent between all of your brush strokes. You can see with all these different settings at our disposal, we can create basically any kind of brush imaginable for whatever painting tasks we might be confronted with. From simple paint brushes to more complicated brushes like creating fire or foliage. The only limit is your creativity. Now that we've gone through all of our brush settings, a quick warning. A lot of professional artists will put their brush sets online for free or to buy. This is awesome because you can get some great brushes that some of your favorite artists use. But a lot of new artists fall into a trap where they download too many brushes and never take the time to learn how to use any of them. So if you download brush packs from other artists, it's really important to go through the brush pack and pick out the ones that seem useful to you and delete the rest. Keeping your brushes clean and organized will help you paint significantly faster, as you won't have to keep hunting for your favorite brushes. You'll be able to just find them quickly. So, that was a lot of information. Knowing what all of these settings do is important, but it's not actually useful until we put it into practice. In an upcoming lesson, we'll be covering a simple digital painting process, and a big part of that will be the brushes that we use. So before you move on, take some time to experiment with what we just learned and get familiar with the brush engine. In the next lesson, I'll show you how I like to create my own custom brushes. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you there.